Dr. Virginia Stage, who is from the Department of Nutrition Science, the College of Allied Health Sciences at East Carolina University. Dr. Stage is the director of the Food-Based Early Education, or FEED Lab. She's an associate professor of nutrition and a registered dietitian nutritionist. She has specific training and expertise in preschool-based interventions focused on improving dietary quality and school readiness outcomes among low-resource racial ethnic minority children. Existing valid methods for assessing intake among young children is time-intensive and expensive. Therefore, to support her work, she also actively investigates the use of the objective non-invasive tools, including the Veggie meter, to measure young children's fruit and vegetable intake. And with that, I will hand it over to Virginia.
Hi. I'm going to talk a little differently about use of the Veggie meter. Stephanie's studies are really fascinating for informing us as we move forward and use it in the field. We've been using it and looking more closely at the feasibility of it, particularly in a young child setting and how young children respond to it, as well as their families, as well as is it able to measure change in short periods of time and long periods of time? Is it sensitive to that? So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we've used the Veggie meter in Head Start preschool children to assess their fruit and vegetable intake. So just to start real quick, how I got down this path as a doctoral student, I really wanted to figure out ways to assess intake in young children. You know, many of them are still developing language skills. Developmentally, they're not really capable of telling you what they've eaten. Anyone that has a child or has interacted with a young child knows this. You might get a really interesting story, but it's very likely not accurate. And so I wanted to figure out ways that we could try to assess these things in developmentally appropriate ways. And prior to that time, what we were using was plate waste, which is already difficult, but in a child care center, when you have family style dining, plate waste is just a nightmare. Or we were asking adults, which meant that we were asking parents who weren't with the child all day, or teachers who weren't with the child all day, or trying to mesh those things together. It's very difficult to try to figure out what children are actually eating. So this led me down the road based on a paper that Guthrie at USDA had published to use pictorial methods initially. Can we use pictures of fruits and vegetables to try to get an understanding of how children respond to it, how they like it? And we were able to validate a tool, which you'll see later, to assess pictorially children's liking. Now, at the time, and still to some extent, pictorial measures were considered valid measures for assessing, if you did enough front-end work on the pictures, children's liking and preference, which is a variable that's predictive of a visual intake. So it's not intake itself, but it's predictive. There's still lots of problems with this. Every time you create a new version of the tool with new foods, you have to go and sit in front of 3, 4, and 5-year-olds and ask them what they see. It's like the Rorschach test. Super fun, but a lot of work. And that's after you've actually created all these images. So this is an image of, clearly, pineapple rings. It's one of my first pictures. It's a little grainy because it's about 15 years old at this point. But a lot of children actually thought this was bracelets, right? So this image doesn't work because, well, it's bracelets to a 4-year-old. And some of you might agree with this little boy who told me this was actually monsters, not spinach. So going through this process, every single time we want to develop a new version of the tool, which is appropriate for every new study you do with a new group of kids, right? They could see these things differently, is very difficult. So a little bit more insight to those of you that are not familiar with assessments in young children. This is a quick table, and more than happy to share these references, but hopefully by the time I talk to you about this, you don't want them. But this just shows you kind of a rundown of what we typically use when we're assessing intake in young children. You have parent reports and you have child reports. Unfortunately, quite a number of them are very expensive and time intensive. And when it comes to the parent reports, I don't really trust what I get. I'm a parent of a 5-year-old. I can't tell you what he eats all day. So the subjectivity of that is very concerning. Plate waste is very challenging, and so is a biomedical assessment. There are easier methods that we can use, like a taste and rate or a pictorial, where we can get in front of a child and talk to them and have them tell us what they like, but that's still not a direct measure, right? That's just us telling them, you're asking them, you know, how much do you like strawberries, showing them an image or giving them a piece to taste, which is a willingness to try assessment. and then having them tell us on a scale, do you like this or not? That doesn't mean that they're going to go to lunch and then eat that food. Now, our studies that have validated these tools says it's likely that that's going to happen, but it's still not a good measure. So our team, when Stephanie Gilcott actually introduced us to the Veggie meter, got very excited about the Veggie meter because of its potential to assess more objectively fruit and vegetable intake, particularly in young children, where we have all of these challenges with regards to trying to figure out what they're eating. And there's still limitations to the Veggie meter, but at least it's a little bit more objective, and it's fast with young children as well who have short attention spans. So we got very excited and started looking at this closer. First, really, does this work in the field? How do children respond? How do families respond? And we've had a lot of positive interactions with the tool. People are very excited about it. They want to know what their score is, that kind of interaction. But I do want to tell you, as you already know, this has not been validated in young children yet. So there's a lot of really promising studies that have shown this to be a valid tool in adults. But even as we move forward and talk about this study I'm about to introduce, keep that in mind. Like, we have not actually done the studies to validate this study in young children yet. So I'm going to talk briefly about an intervention study that we did that utilized STEAM, food-based learning activities to assess children's liking. So we did use that pictorial tool I talked about a few minutes ago, as well as the Veggie meter to assess fruit and vegetable intake. And for those of you not familiar with the STEAM acronym, it's basically STEM in preschool. It just adds in the arts to it. And we hypothesized that exposure to these learning activities, which increases vegetable exposure in positive environments. So the theory of mere exposure, the more frequently you expose children to vegetables, the more likely they're going to consume those when they have the opportunity. We theorized that that exposure would result in an increase in liking as well as an increase in the Veggie meter scores. So our intervention was implemented in one Head Start center in Eastern North Carolina. This is a pilot. There were 2 additional centers that did serve as comparison sites. They were in the same Head Start program, which meant they were utilizing the same menu in each center and were in the same community. The intervention was about 4 months long and had 7 learning activities that exposed them to fruits and vegetables, as you'll see that they were already familiar with, and that parents said were culturally appropriate for their families. We also selected vegetables that were higher in skin carotenoids so that they were leaning on that end, which is important when you're using this tool, although you will see a few of these, like cauliflower, are a little bit more challenging in that area. Parents filled out a demographic survey. We also assessed children's neophobic level, which, if you know anything about young children, it's the fear of new food. So how hesitant were they to try vegetables, especially, which tends to be more challenging for young children. We also assessed prior exposure to target vegetables. I'll show that in a minute. That was just making sure that children had exposure to these vegetables ahead of time. We used the Veggie meter to assess the fruit and vegetable intake, and I will put a side note in there in terms of acceptability. One thing that we do in our studies is make sure that we go into the center and interact with family, staff, and children with the tool before we start collecting any data, before we even really consent. It's more like we're going in and just kind of playing around with it, introducing it to families, saying, hey, this is a Veggie meter. Have you ever seen this before? In a Head Start setting, they're on more of a public school schedule, so you don't have school in the summer. They go in and they do their enrollments in the summer, and it's a great time to interact with families. And we find when we then eventually do send out those consents that we don't have as much hesitation about parents signing that form because they know exactly what we're talking about. Whereas before, if you just kind of sent where we want to scan your finger, your child's finger, and get their dietary quality, that's a little scary for a parent that hasn't seen it and done it themselves. We also find for children who are a little scared and hesitant to then interact and even put their finger in that dark hole, it's very comical the first time a child does it because they don't know if something's going to prick them or what's going to happen when their finger goes in there. But we find once we actually start collecting data, if we've allowed that child to have an interaction or two, again, theory of mere exposure, just in a different way, we have a lot less trouble getting children actually do the measurement. which can be a challenge on the front end, especially for children who are fearful. And then the second tool we had here is the liking. So this is just what that image looks like. We had delivered that on a iPad, and every child would get an image of the foods that are targeted plus some additional ones. It is a 5-point scale with that face on the right being super yucky. In terms of our sample, we had 113 children, 49 were in the intervention. These are just a list of all of the demographic information. I just want to point out the only difference between the two groups was age. There was a slightly older group in the intervention, but everything else was the same as in not significantly different. Oh, I'm going backwards now. Sorry about that. As I said, we did assess with families prior exposure to vegetables that we had in our intervention. We feel this is important for access long-term. If you're trying to improve children's intake of fruits and vegetables, they need to actually have these fruits and vegetables in their environment. The novel foods can be tricky. Great, you got them to eat kiwi, but are they actually going to have kiwi at home? So we focus a lot on those familiar foods. And as you can see, with a couple of exceptions, both groups had frequent exposure to those foods. And we also assessed over the time of our intervention how often those things showed up on the menu as well. And 4 of our key vegetables showed up number of times, particularly broccoli. There's a lot of broccoli on that menu. In terms of our first research question with liking, as you can see here, we actually saw a slight decline. It is not significantly different, but we did see a slight decline in liking in children that were in the intervention group. So there was a time by group interaction that was significant in that the change over time was significant in the decline area. And I'll talk about that in a little bit in terms of the actual intervention. When it came to the second research question with regards to the skin to carotenoids, we found something interesting with regards to the intervention group. We measured 3 time points for both of these tools, and with the skin carotenoids, we actually found significant differences between the groups at post, with the intervention group remaining basically fairly flat and the control group having a significant drop off. Now, one thing I want you to kind of remember, we were giving them little fruits and vegetables to explore and taste. We were not giving them enough to potentially have a bump up. We need to still work on access. We wanted to go in and just see what happens when you expose them to the activities and the foods. So the baseline sort of maintaining for the intervention group was important to see, with the control group dropping off, which was interesting. They didn't get those activities.